Okay, so let's talk now about user interfaces for a little bit. We're going to look at structure and content and go over some basic sort of user interface um, elements that we might have in our game. So you've seen this diagram before. We looked at this earlier in the semester when we were talking about game design in general. So this is sort of a conception of the game system where if you start with the player as the black box, the player chooses a control, which is an input. That control goes to the game program. The game program then produces some kind of output or feedback, and the player uses that to make their next decision. So that's the sort of flow that we're looking at in terms of how we actually like design games. So UI specifically fits into the sort of control and feedback. So that's the top and bottom of our little cycle here, right? So the first place that UI sort of happens is between the control and the game program. So this part of the UI that deals with accepting player inputs like virtual buttons, sliders, menu choices, etc. requires some kind of physical control to select, but they provide an additional layer of control before we get to the stage where your game program takes over. So there will be UI elements that are dealing with accepting player controls, right? They're usually visual in nature, though not always. And then the other place that the UI fits in is in the feedback. So lots of UI elements are not under the player's control. As we saw with Ori, there are lots of things that are sort of for information only, like a health meter or an ammunition counter, but they display valuable information that the players need to know about kind of on an ongoing basis. So things like meters, scores, and maps and points are all feedback. So a good user interface constrains and guides player choice. And if you remember back to our lecture about persuasion techniques, UI is definitely involved in the different like sort of game design persuasion techniques to try and get players to focus in on the experience that we want them to have. So from the point of view of the developer, you should understand how your program works in response to various controls. You understand the feedback it produces in response to controls, but what you don't understand or predict is the player. And like it or not, they're kind of part of your game. So the UI helps you to begin to do some kind of player prediction. So instead of guessing random things that your player might do, you can point them to specific places on the screen where they can use their controls, like buttons or sliders, right? You can also provide feedback. And feedback begins to predict or even control the kinds of reactions that players will have to various situations. So, for example, if the player knows how much HP a boss has left, or if that boss is about to counterattack, they may react in predictable ways, like performing a strong attack on a weakened enemy or readying a block if they know they're about to be hit, right? Like those are the expected, sort of ideal things that we want the player to do in those situations. So knowing what the player might do gives you more ways to control the experience of the game and make it more exciting. Feedback is essential to guiding the player to the next part of your game, letting them know that they're doing something right. So when players know how well they're doing, they feel in control, which is, we've talked about this, it's called autonomy, and that feeling's really powerful. So in the end, games are kind of not about producing complex systems or simulations. They're about producing experiences, and UI is all about that. So let's look at some of these UI elements in detail that we've mentioned so you can get a feel for where they fit into your game. All right, so the first one that we're going to look at is scores or numerical progress. So a score helps your player understand their progress in learning a skill, usually. Some scores are numerical. In Angry Birds, for example, you can see your current score and high score, so you immediately know by comparing numbers whether you're doing better than your best run. The developers also use size and color to indicate when your score is being added to by a lot, such as when you hit a pig, or a little bit, birds bouncing and hitting blocks. Some scores are calculated to give a star rating or a grade or a title. In Ninja Gaiden, your ninja rankings based on a number of factors like karma, kills, time to complete a chapter. Not all games show the numerical score used to calculate your rating, but sometimes, it kind of depends on the genre of your game and what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so meters, things like countdowns, cooldowns, ammunition, and health all kind of fall into the category of meter. So a meter in a bar can be used for a wide variety of uses, like the ones that I just mentioned. Health is kind of the most notable one here. So this is a great representation of both the maximum and the current amount of something, and can be used for any element where the maximum amount is crucial to know. So in HP, generally speaking, it's it's good to know like the percentage of it that you have left, for example. So showing the max amount and then a bar showing like that you have 50% actually remaining is helpful to you, because then you know when you have to heal. So sometimes the developer only wants the player to know the fraction. So like this boss has around half its health, but not exactly how much that is, without knowing the numerical maximum. So you can kind of use meters with numbers attached or without. In FF7, for example, bars are used to show how close you are to your limit break and for your HP and MP. Health and magic are accompanied by numbers, since you need to know exactly how much you have left. So, for example, whether you have enough MP to cast a spell that costs 20 MP. But your limit break is just a bar, so you only approximately know how close you are to getting it. Fallout 3 uses a more nuanced meter that shows you like kind of a granular view of your HP and action points, your AP. It also uses a standard bar for the condition of the weapon. And you can visually compare this to other weapons bars as you repair your weapon. So that's like another way that meters are used. And then fighting games like Soul Calibur have been using health meters for decades as a measure of whether you're winning or losing. So this is kind of performing a dual purpose, right? Meters can also be made so the gauge starts in the middle and moves up or down. So morality systems like the one in Knights of the Old Republic for your light and dark side meter kind of works that way. So this affects, in this game, it affects what kind of powers your player gets, and also probably what kind of dialogue options they get. So that can be a good visual shorthand for players as well. All right, buttons are mainly in mouse and keyboard games. So these are on-screen buttons that you actually have to click or navigate to in some way. So usually you use them when you need to have a precise way of selecting something on the screen. They're used to make choices, either for general UI purposes like start game, but also for things like choosing a spell or an ability to use. Civ 5, or Civ 6 at this point, is a PC game that involves a lot of strategy and choice. So buttons are used to select actions for your units, change or select technology, talk to other leaders in the game, among many other things, right? Most buttons involve some kind of iconography, so like a picture or a symbol. But buttons might just have text on them, like the "A unit needs orders" button at the top of the minimap. Hotkeys are buttons which are also mapped to keyboard controls. So for example, the bottom row can be mapped to the number keys in like a game like World of Warcraft, for example. So this way you can either click the button with the mouse or just hit a key to perform the action more quickly. It's pretty common in multiplayer games where you need to have like kind of fast reactions. Most console games use signifiers of controller buttons somewhere on screen, usually a bar along the bottom, to indicate which controller buttons can be pressed to perform actions. So we saw that in Ori, for example. The on-screen buttons are usually also required to closely match the design of the real controller buttons. That's required by the platform usually, so it'll look different from console to console. So menus are used whenever there's a large number of choices to be made or collectibles to be stored and called upon. Menus can be shallow, which means they only have one panel with every item listed, or deep, where you have to navigate through several screens to actually get to the item you want. Deep menus are also sometimes called nested menus. So these are great for choices that depend on a hierarchy, like do I want equipment or items, what kind of weapon, what character does it go on, and so on. Radial menus are popular because they're relatively easy to control with an analog stick, so they're used a lot in console games. They're better for games where you only have a few options and you can kind of keep them shallow. There's not any like deep navigation here. So usually radial menus don't contain hierarchies. Inventory screens are kind of a subset of menus. So JRPG inventories, for example, tend to be like long lists of names, possibly with icons denoting the type of object you're looking at. Other inventory systems have chosen to forego text in favor of graphical representations for objects the player is carrying. So these traditional menu-based inventories are really good for games where inventory has no special meaning and it's possible to carry an essentially infinite number of items. But some games, especially survival games or crafting games, so like The Flame and the Flood, for example, use a set number of slots to force inventory management. So item management is much more obvious because you only have so much physical space to store everything that you need. This is also really crucial for survival or horror games where resource management is kind of integral to the experience of tension, because a lack of items can mean the difference between life and death. Skyward Sword and other Zelda games usually have very specific slots for items, so the slot might be even the exact shape of the item that goes in it because there are only so many in the game. And adventure games like Zelda often have limited equipment, and character progression is really dependent on acquiring specific key items at specific points in the game. So the inventory is almost a way to represent progression through the story. So you can see how inventory can be used in like quite a few different ways to reflect like the different pillars and values of the game, right? Icons are one area of UI where it's really great to have a graphic designer around. So these are like little memory aids for your player. If you use them well, the players learn to associate your icons with different attacks, spells, statuses, equipment, and locations without the need for text to clutter things up. Icons can be very iconic in nature, so like really simplistic designs, or they can be more complex and artistic depending on the needs and the style of your game and the size that it's going to be on screen. So the Final Fantasy games have used iconography to describe, for example, status effects like sleep, silence, and poison, as well as elements like fire, ice, and thunder. And they actually carry that through their whole series, right? It's one of the things that ties the series together. So if you've been playing Final Fantasy for a long time, if you see, a little dialogue bubble with 3 dots in it, you know that means that someone's silenced. So there's one icon for the effect and one for, in this case, whether it's like a positive or negative effect, and then a percentage. So that consistency can be really good for like building a brand. Horizon Zero Dawn and other open world games usually use iconography to denote key places on the overworld map. So it's really important for the design of these icons to be clear, readable, and distinguishable from each other at a quick glance so the player can find what they need easily. Okay, so maps or mini maps are used for orienting the player in their current environment. So they usually show terrain, special objects, enemies, and NPCs. They're used when you want the player to be able to plan and strategize for what they will find ahead. The minimap in Breath of the Wild shows terrain outlines, quest locations, any key map markers that the players have placed for themselves, and the position and direction of the player character, which is usually really important, especially in open world games. Deus Ex used minimaps really effectively to show enemies. So it had different icons for enemies that had spotted you versus those that hadn't, because Deus Ex is very like stealth oriented, or it can be, as well as the direction that the enemies are facing. It lacked actually an outline of terrain, which was a specific design choice, most likely, that forced the players to discover novel routes to different areas. So more features would be added to the minimap as you unlocked abilities, and so the minimap really became like part of the whole HUD was kind of like tied to your actual character's progression. Overworld maps are a little bit different. So these are used for orienting the player in the game world as a whole. So they're usually still used for planning strategies and quests, but kind of on a longer time scale. They're usually not visible in the HUD because they require too much space, so they're their own game screen most likely, and they usually pause play. Not always. So in Metroidvanias like Ori and the Blind Forest, for example, the game map is crucial to gameplay, which tends to be centered around unlocking new movement abilities to get to new areas. So you need to know which areas you haven't accessed, right? They usually show what's been visited and what hasn't, as well as having a number of helpful icons that may or may not also be unlocked with abilities, such as locations of key items or even your position on the map. So like when you play Hollow Knight, for example, you actually start with no map. You have to buy map. Once you do that, you can buy additional things that let you update the map and also let you like see your position on it. Breath of the Wild's vast world has kind of a vast and zoomable map to match. It contains very detailed renderings of the terrain so you can find and mark hidden quest items more easily, and also keeps a record of the shrines you visited so that you can warp to them later, as well as other items. So this map also allowed for player-generated markers that you can mark your own like key locations of interest, such as like Korok seeds or weapons or other things that you might need, kind of according to the player's goals, which can change a lot in the course of the game. So it being a very open world game that you're meant to come back to after long periods of time, it was important that the markers on the map be player oriented, because that is probably one of their pillars. And then finally, the heads up display is, or HUD as it's called, is very common in a wide variety of games to show sort of pertinent and usually numerical information on screen. So usually the HUD is on the screen at all times, except in cutscenes or possibly when the player is in a menu. It can be modified depending on the player's situation, such as in or out of battle. The HUD is a combination of other UI elements that we've already talked about. So in No Man's Sky, the HUD is a combination of sort of environmental information, health, and ammo. As an explorer in often hazardous environments, it's really important that players be able to know the ways in which the environment might kill you, what your status is, and what tool or weapon you have equipped and how much ammo it has. First-person games also include a reticule for aiming, in most cases. In VATS mode in Fallout 3, your HUD displays the statistical likelihood of hitting different parts of your enemy with your weapon, as well as the enemy's health. It continues to show your health, direction, action points, and weapon condition, because those are all still important when you're in battle. In first-person games, the HUD also typically contains a reticule again, so you can be very precise about where your weapon is pointed. Alright, so in games where there are like sort of role-playing elements or progression in some ways, unique skills and the ability to level up is like a pretty common trope. So I think a lot of the conventions that are used come from tabletop games, and particularly Dungeons and Dragons, in that the player often receives a number of points which they can spend on stat increases and skills, etc. There are a few different ways to handle leveling. Some games do it automatically, but when the player has a choice in how they want to grow, then you have to provide some sort of visual interface for that to happen, right? So UIs for leveling up are all about making the player feel powerful and in control, while only providing a few options at a time so you don't overwhelm them or wreck your game's balance. Dragon Age used the relatively common practice of a skill tree to level characters. This is something BioWare has a lot of experience with at this point. So the player usually has a number of skill points or something similar to work with, and they can spend the points on abilities. Usually the abilities are constraints. There are only a few choices per level, and it is not usually possible to get every skill on a single character by the end of the game, which encourages replayability so that you can like try different combinations, right? One of the many cool things about FF10 was the Sphere Grid, which at the time took an RPG level up system that was largely outside the player's control and put it into the hands of the players using a very unique interface. So note that you can't choose just any stat increase, you have to follow a set path. But the path has enough branching points that it lets players feel in control while still kind of maintaining game balance. It's not the most fun part of games, but most games include settings of some kind. These relate to in-game variables like difficulty. They could be graphics and sound settings, controller mappings, etc. It's important to have some. At minimum, your game is probably going to have audio settings. That's probably the bare minimum, but hopefully you'll have more than that. All right, so given all of these like different kinds of screens, different kinds of UI elements and things that we've looked at, what are you actually going to be making? You're going to be doing, so if you're doing the UI design portion of the GDD, you'll be making one sketch or mock-up per screen in the previous section. So when you have identified your screen flow, how many screens are in your game, you'll make a sketch for each one, and you'll answer two questions. What content will you show the player, and where will that content be on the screen? So in terms of what to show, all the answers to this question should be in your game mechanics section, but if you're not, this is a good time to fill it out. So you may want to decide what will be visible rules to the player, so what information you want to expose to them. Presumably some of your rules will not actually be like visible or directly communicated to your player. It's going to be something that you're expecting them to figure out in some other way. So once you know what the rules are that you intend to show all the time, like how much HP they have, for example, that's going to inform how your UI is going to look for that screen. So if it's a UI element, something that happens on like an overlay over top of the main game screen, as opposed to character animation or special effects or something like that, then it should end up somewhere in your design. This does include UI elements that are in-game, like a health bar above a character's head, for example, as opposed to like an overlay on top. That's still a UI element. You should still include like notes about that at the very least. And then in terms of where to show, this is extremely genre dependent, so I can't really answer this question for you, but in general, you want to make sure that your UI is not in the way of gameplay. So you are often utilizing the edges of the screen, the corners and the center, top and bottom, and also it depends on if the importance of the information is so great that you need players to see it right away. You may put it in front and center, but that probably also means that you'll pause gameplay when you're showing it. Players do tend to not see things at the periphery of their concentration. So if they're concentrating in the middle of the screen, they may not see things that are happening on the outsides. That's why we add lots of like nice juicy animations to things to try and like draw their eye to other places if we need them to see some important information. But you'll be doing usability and playtesting eventually, one hopes, so you will figure out what your players are seeing and not seeing very quickly. Just to give you a quick example of what I mean by this, iteration is key. Don't worry, you'll probably change everything. These are some of the game screens from Quench, showing how our HUD changed over the years from something very basic in our prototype. That first prototype from 2014 is what was actually submitted like to the game programming program. And we just came up with something quick. We just figured out what all the information was that we were going to show and put it somewhere. In subsequent iterations, we experimented with putting things in the corner. Finally settled on having your weather powers, which are your main controls, kind of in the bottom center of the screen, and health in the top left, or herd health. So you have various animals that you're controlling, so you get to see like different information about them. You can see that between 2017 and 2019 we added a lot of detail in terms of what you can actually like see on your herd icon, and that was something that we workshopped quite a bit, so that was an interesting process. So what you will be drawing in terms of these sketches are what we call wireframes. So these are labeled boxes, usually in grayscale because we don't need color at this point. We're just trying to figure out position, size, like relative importance, and showing what kinds of information we'll show. So you'll want to tell me what kind of UI element you're using in the space, tie it back to your mechanics. Again, what does the player need to know? You can search online for game UI wireframes for examples of what a wireframe looks like, but I also have some included here. So in these examples, you can see that you're usually abstracting elements down to just boxes and content areas with labels so the reader can follow along. Images are represented as boxes with an X drawn through them. So whenever you see that, that usually represents an image. And in fact, you can show your main game area as a big X with or a big box with an X through it if you want. You can use pencil and paper to make these. You could use sticky notes, like one sticky note per screen. You could use a program like Miro if you're already familiar with that, or Adobe XD if that's interesting to you. If you decide to hand draw your sketches, it's acceptable to take a picture with your phone. Just try to make sure that you have a good amount of light so that I can see what's going on in your GDD. So you can just attach that picture to your document. But yeah, you're going to see commonly in these wireframes, you are doing obviously one wireframe per screen, so you might be having like arrows in between the different screens to show the progression. You're going to want to block out where different boxes or icons are. You know, where does dialogue go? If it's an inventory screen, you might be saying like this is where the items are going to be listed out, and they're going to be listed as icons, and you know it's going to be in this area, that sort of thing. If you have questions about how to do a wireframe, let me know. We might do a little live example if you're interested. And here's just another example again from Quench. So in the first image here, it says wireframe underneath the camera. So the first image is a quick sketch that showed how an aspect of our HUD was going to change when the player entered what's called shepherding mode. So they're selecting where their animals are going to go next. So we showed icon location, selection, visible button prompts, and in-game UI, so the actual path. So in the sketch, you can see that even though it's quite simple, it's loaded with a lot of information, and there are some notes at the side for the designers to show like what's actually going to be changing. In the second screenshot, you will see a mock-up of how those icons were actually going to appear in game. So we did like a very in-depth mock-up at that point of what all the information was that we're going to need to show on the icon. And then finally in game you can see how it kind of ended up compared to the sketch. And you can see it's actually pretty similar. We are showing the button prompts at the bottom. You can see the paths for the different like directions that you can send your animals. You can see that the icon is lit up because it's selected. all that stuff is kind of in there. So for this assignment, you only are doing the initial sketch portion of this, so it might be quite messy. You can see it doesn't need to be particularly detailed or even particularly well drawn in order to get your point across. But it's good to have kind of a strong vision of where things are going to go on the screen.